was fabulous. Just wait till you get to the second session. And I only regret that we didn't give enough space for what is the progress or regress on the economic issue. I think you see it, you've got an excellent moderator and five of probably the best, five of the experts on the issue of Ukraine and its energy and its economic and energy needs. So with that, Ambassador Roman Popadiuk, I told you there are several deans of American modern diplomacy. He's one of them. And so with that,
Walter, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the economic session. I think we're in store for a very robust and informative discussion. Obviously, the success of Ukraine in the economic sphere is going to determine the future of the country to a great extent. And indeed, the challenges that Ukraine faces on the economic front are very daunting. If you look at, in terms of the costs that might be involved in this situation due to the war with Russia, the World Bank estimates that it'll be a little under $600 billion over 10 years to build Ukraine. I think personally, that's probably on the conservative side. It's going to be a lot more than $600 billion that they speak about. And every sector of the economy has been impacted, but the three that are most highlighted are housing, transportation, and of course, energy is a key component of this. But housing, infrastructure, transportation, et cetera, are very, very key sectors that have been impacted and will need complete overhauls. In terms of funding this situation, it's going to be very daunting for the Ukrainian government. Obviously, the government itself will not be able to tackle this. They'll have to look to outside financing. And the only ones that will be able to really jumpstart the process and move the process forward is the external community, namely governments must take the lead in organizing the reconstruction funds. Secondly, would probably be the international financial institutions such as the World Bank itself, International Finance Corporation, et cetera. And thirdly, will be the private investors. I think private investors will be reluctant to come into a situation in a post-war Ukraine where it's unclear how things will be functioning without some kind of guarantees or support from governments to underlay the basic infrastructure and to underlay the investment opportunities. So those will be some of the issues that will be tackled. Now, some steps have already been taken in this direction. The Ukrainian government is actually talking with institutions about post-war reconstruction. You've seen and heard of a lot of conferences and read about a lot of conferences and ideas about how this reconstruction can take place. Indeed, I'm happy to know that two people that have been involved in a recent extensive study of post-war reconstruction efforts are with us on the panel today, and those are Anders Åslund and Joseph Hughes from Drexel University. I'm proud to say that I was able to join with them, and we produced a report that was presented, those recommendations, I should say, were presented at an April conference in New York City, and the final report is due out in July. The report will help everyone understand the vast challenges that Ukraine faces throughout its whole society, whether it's social, economic, political, et cetera, in overcoming the conflict-torn country that Russia has created in Ukraine. So what I would like to, and I'm sure that both Anders and Joseph will be able to share some perspectives from that study. What I'd like to do is probably start off with Anders, and then bookend everything with Joseph. So we'll just go down the row here. Joining Anders and Joseph are Howard Shatz, Margarita Assenova, and Ariel Cohen. I'm not going to go over their bios because you all know them. They've been speakers here in the past. And at the same time, their bios are in the brochure, the program for today. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to each of our speakers. They'll each give a presentation of approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll follow with Q&A from the audience. Anders?
Thank you very much, Roman. Yes, I would like to start with the main conclusions that we have in this study that the Ambassador Popadiuk mentioned. But first, I would like to thank Walter for a new invitation, and very happy to see that you are keeping this up and you have a very good, steady crew coming to these events. this Monday, on the 15th of June, a very important decision was made. The European Union invited Ukraine and Moldova to start accession negotiations. And they opened the first big batch of chapters. And there's now discussion to open all the 5 remaining batches of chapters in July already. So the European Union is really speeding this up. Then you immediately ask, how long will this take? Well, normally the negotiations, if they are well run, take 2 to 3 years. And the Ukrainians, of course, say, we want to become members in 2027. Won't happen. But it is the process that is important. But this process it's not a real negotiation. It is that the European Commission sits and checks with the Ukrainian officials that the Ukrainian legislation is good enough. So this is an enormous advantage for Ukraine. What should you like or dislike about it? Virtually all of it is good, apart from a couple of points. Agriculture will be the biggest problem. Ukraine has better agriculture than any European country, and that will be a big problem. And fisheries is normally a big problem, but Ukraine doesn't have much of fisheries, so that is not a problem. And then we have environmental demands, which tend to be enormous on the EU side, and there I'm sure that Ukraine can get concessions. That is delays, at least in fulfilling the demands. Poland did get that. So it's nothing unique. So the big problem is only agriculture in terms of negotiating something. And then Ukraine will have to fulfill all the demands. It was mentioned in the previous panel how civil society stood up in defense of NABO and SAPO in July last year. But I think that was more important was that the European Economy Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, a few hours after the legislation had been adopted, made a call to Kiev and said, oh, I see, you don't want to have a rule of law, then of course you don't want the European Union. And then we can't provide you with financing. So it was a very strict condition from the European Union. You have to do away with this odious law. And happily, the President Zelensky got rid of the law in 1 week's time. We are likely to see more events of this nature, and I think that they are entirely positive for Ukraine, while certain members of the elite will dislike the demands. They will not be easy, but that's how the European Union operates. So what is important for Ukraine? What makes the economy function? There are 3 things. First, financing. And as Ambassador Popadiuk mentioned, the financing now will come overwhelmingly from government, and it will be the European Union and its member countries, or you can say Europe more broadly. We should not forget Norway, which gives 8.5 billion euro to Ukraine annually now, and Britain. So it's Europe in broad terms. And Ukraine needs about $100 billion a year, and which amounts to half of GDP. And the good news is that it does get this money, because the European Union has now stepped up where the US has abandoned Ukraine. Note that the US did not give any money at all to Ukraine last year. And also when it comes to arms, it's Europe that is filling up, but most of all, of course, Ukraine itself. The second thing that is needed that we don't talk much about any longer, it's shipping over the Black Sea. Ukraine exports predominantly commodities. 60% of Ukraine's export now is agricultural goods, and it used to be 40%. When steel, iron ore used to be 40%, now it's much less, but it's still the second biggest. So Ukraine essentially exports commodities, and they are not profitable if they are transported by rail. So they have to be shipped over the sea. And the good news is that Ukraine, since September 2023, has managed to keep shipping over the Black Sea functioning very well. So we don't talk about it any longer. This is a great Ukrainian military success. And then the third thing that we talk a lot about is electricity. Ukraine's GDP fell slightly in the first quarter of this year because of a shortage of electricity. So it's vital to keep the lights on in Ukraine. And the relevant companies here is mainly private ITIC and Ukrenergo, the state-owned company, grid company that are keeping it going. And that functions amazingly well. But it has been a problem in the winter. The Russians are extremely skillful at bombing with great precision the relevant electricity assets. They have bombed 8 of the big hydropower dams, and you don't repair them very fast. They have bombed all coal-powered power stations. And what they have not bombed, fortunately, is the 3 big nuclear power stations, because that would be too dangerous. It would lead to a nuclear catastrophe. So fortunately, that has not happened, and I don't think it will happen. And the nuclear power stations deliver about 55% of the electricity in Ukraine. The coal-powered power stations, fortunately, can be repaired very fast. And this is primarily DTEC that has repaired them with an amazing speed. And then what is the future? Renewable energy. Solar can be delivered very fast. Wind is necessary as a complement, and then you need batteries. And there are 2 big advantages with the renewables, or more of them. But one is that they are small. It's not worthwhile to bomb a wind turbine. So therefore, the Russians let them stand. And they have stolen some solar, but not the wind turbines. And another advantage is that it's decentralized. You can have a solar cell on your balcony, and in that way, people can keep their electricity going without any major intervention by the state or big companies. So Ukraine is likely to be a leading country when it comes to renewable energy. And also, by the way, in Ukraine has enormous space. So the typical NIMBY problem, not in my backyard, is not a strong argument. I haven't even heard it in Ukraine. So these are the 3 things that really needs to be done. Financing, shipping, and electricity. And the critical issue that we rightly discuss so much now is the electricity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for that excellent overview. I'd like to just pick up on 2 points that you made and just emphasize them. You made mention about the Black Sea lanes being kept open for Ukraine exports. That is a huge military success, as you rightly pointed out. And I think a lot of people don't give Ukraine credit. They talk about the war and Ukraine being on the defensive, but Ukraine has had a lot of successes in the Black Sea. Is one of the successes that Ukraine has had, and is now having on the land. And that's the other point was the Russian bombing of the electrical grids and all electrical sources of generation of electricity. And particularly during this past winter, the Russians made a sustained effort to basically submit Ukraine to a horrible cold winter and tried to win the war by freezing Ukraine out, basically. And that failed. And that attests to the resilience of the Ukrainian people and also their innovations. For example, I think you made mention of some of these, but the Ukrainians resorted to, campfires, basically, for lack of a better term, 10 cities, battery operated sources, portable generators, anything to keep the heat and power going. And they survived. And they show that, as they've shown throughout the centuries, how resilient they are in terms of the challenges that they face. So 2 very important points. Howard, we'll turn to you now.
Thank you. And as everyone says, I have to say too, thank you, Walter, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start with just the trajectory of the Ukrainian economy. What have we seen since the big war started? 2022, decline in GDP of about 28.5%, and then rapid growth in 2023, 5.5%. But since then, it's been on a downhill trajectory, 2.9 in 2024, 1.8 in 2025. 2026, the projections are all over the place. We're looking at 1% or 2.2%. First quarter was very difficult, as Anders said. And then we get to what might happen in 2027. Well, that will depend fully on whether the war ends or not, or whether there is some kind of ceasefire in the war. If the war continues, projections are worse. They're less than 1% growth. If the war ends, we're looking at 4% growth of the cost to demobilization, but also the hope of reconstruction. So that's what the context is. What I'll be doing is I want to talk about their macroeconomic management, some of the problems the economy is facing, some elements of the reform program. And then I want to come back to EU accession. I'm very glad that Anders said it. I think this is going to be very important, especially the chapter that was open. It'll be very important, even though it doesn't necessarily focus on economy, it will be very important for the economy. So let's start with macroeconomic management. What are the challenges Ukraine is under? Well, it's got a full-scale war going on, requiring a defense budget of 33% of GDP, a public deficit of about 20%, varying, and all non-defense spending dependent on foreign aid. Given that, macroeconomic management has been exceptional. They've shown budget discipline. They're raising local revenue. They're adequate foreign exchange reserves. Inflation expectations have largely been anchored. Inflation in January was actually lower than pre-war. And the external aid has been very strong. The one problem with that external aid, it's mostly loans, right? Ukraine would benefit more from grants, but what those loans have meant is that public debt has risen from less than half of GDP in early 2022 to more than 100% of GDP now. The other positive thing about macroeconomic management, conditions-based foreign exchange liberalization. And they have a largely market economy, so that's very positive for what they're doing. Now, what about the problems they're facing? Well, some things are clearly not that far, right? War, right? The energy, as Anders mentioned, as others have mentioned, they're being exceptional about fixing energy. That's been a source of their capital investment, in fact. A big problem has been trade logistics. That has affected grain exports in the past season. And then they still have very, very large labor shortages, especially in the high-skilled area. And that will continue to be a problem. But what's been the reaction? Well, there have been positive moves. Digitization of the economy has been very positive. As we said, the energy repairs have been very good. And businesses are taking care of their own energy in some ways. They're importing batteries, power backup. Most businesses have such backup for when energy systems go out. There's also progress in the quality of education, which will have importance for the future economy. And very positive, they've granted their first wartime export licenses. We talked a lot about the Ukrainian defense industry. It's exceptional. It's still only a very small part of the economy, right? Less the drone economy that we always talk about, less than 2%. Metallurgical production, still more than 10%. But the fact that the Ukrainian technology, Ukrainian drones might be reaching the rest of the world now is very positive for them. What are some other issues which really policy could be responding to? Very high levels of informality in the economy. That hurts their tax collection ability. Weak business environment in general. Access to finance remains a problem for businesses. And then we have to recognize, and it's become more and more open, it's certainly more important in the past year, corruption remains a very serious problem. And we're going to come back to that with the EU accession talks, right? On the agenda, some of this is related to corruption. So continuing on the agenda is improving tax administration, streamlining enforcement, reducing compliance costs to increase tax revenues and reduce informality, right? Planning for the post-war, they do need to enhance the financial sector supervision, develop stronger financial and capital markets to facilitate post-reconstruction financing. The other big agenda item on the table, besides corruption, but it's linked, is state-owned enterprise, state-owned business reform. This is a quandary. You don't necessarily want to privatize your most important state-owned enterprises during wartime. You might not receive the price you want, but you certainly can improve governance, and there may be opportunities for privatization, which Ukraine has so far not aggressively pursued, but which absolutely needs to happen. So let me go to what happened with EU accession, because this will feed into all of this. What the EU did is they opened what is called the fundamentals cluster. That is the first cluster that gets open for negotiation. It is the last cluster to be closed. And the pace of fundamentals negotiations sets the pace for everything else. Fundamentals negotiations includes laws about judiciary, fundamental rights, anti-corruption, justice, freedom, security, public procurement, another important source of corruption usually, statistics, and then financial control. So it's really about rule of law institutions. And we know from Douglas North, the economist Douglas North, and other economists, and from sociologists, that strong institutions are the foundation of a strong economy, right? So this could be, in fact, very promising for Ukraine. Let me go back to including this. One of the things that the European Union has said in their negotiating statement comes back to corruption. And that is, when they focus on corruption, they want Ukraine to have more ability, NABU to have more of an ability to go after high-risk public positions. And they want SAPO to be able to prosecute members of parliament without permission from the prosecutor general. So the European Union really has in mind quite high-level corruption as they work towards Ukraine accession. On the whole, I'll conclude, right? Ukraine is managing its economy extremely well under wartime. It's hard to imagine most other countries would be able to do this. Some fundamental reforms are stalled, and there is some question about why we're still talking about customs administration reform, and that's been on the agenda for several years. But now with this extra injection of the EU negotiations, I think there's hope in seeing some of these fundamental reforms move forward, which will be good for Ukraine at present, and as important for Ukraine's accession and for Ukraine's post-war recovery. Sir.
Howard, thank you very much for that analysis. I'd like to just pick up on your comments about the defense sector. Rightly so, it's a very small percentage of the economy at this stage. But Ukraine's defense sector, particularly the drone warfare that you outlined, has become very, very noticeable throughout the world, and the whole world is kind of leaning on Ukraine now to supply them with and give them technology in this regard. You notice in the past few months, they've had agreements with a variety of Middle East countries, Europe is actually looking at co-producing or working with Ukraine on the defense sector, particularly drones. So as Ukraine moves forward into a post-war environment, the defense sector, I feel, will probably become a bigger and stronger part of the overall economy and a generator not only of national security means for Ukraine, but also as a source of export as well as development in country. Anyway, Margarita.
I will continue with the topic of energy. Some updated information of what the government is doing in terms of reforms. We know how much the Ukrainian energy sector was devastated, destroyed and damaged by Russian selling. Just imagine this country losing 50% of its energy production. Just imagine it for a second. And how much failure it's going to be on so many fronts, because it's huge. More than half of Ukrainian energy sector was destroyed or damaged. The devastation is particularly high in the thermal and hydroelectric assets, where there is 67% of, right now we have with over 67% of pre-war thermal generation capacity lost. That's almost 70%. And the electricity generation capacity is now a lot small as a result. We talk about repairs of those thermal power plants. Many of them are coal, most of them are coal power plants. But what is happening now is the government is supporting projects to build gas-powered power stations and giving loans through Finland, Ukrainian Investment Fund, state companies already buying those plants to install. So there is, in this situation of making sure people don't have longer blackouts than they do, the government is working with the private sector, with funders, and with energy companies to modernize the economy, to build better plants, to be more in response to what the European Union expects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. One thing that was advantage to Ukraine, the Ukrainian energy system was very large. It was built under the Soviets, but it was built also to withstand a war against the Soviets. So that huge Soviet-built system, although it's outdated and it's falling apart in many places, actually helped Ukraine resist Russian attacks because there was redundancy, and there was also very high intensity of the energy sector. So these both factors, addressing redundancy and reducing intensity, was helping the system survive and be more resilient. Of course, this cannot be the solution. It's just a temporary factor that played well for Ukraine. But Ukraine was exporting electricity for the first 2-3 years of the war. Ukraine was exporting electricity, which was quite amazing, mostly because some of the nuclear power plants, except for Zaryckyj, are still in Ukrainian hands. And they were able to produce electricity mostly through nuclear power plants. But now the situation is changing. Ukraine is importing more electricity than it's exporting, so there is a deficit in this respect. Thankfully, it is very well connected with the European system by the grid system of electricity, and it can get electricity from European member countries very, very quickly. Talking about Russia attacking nuclear facilities, it luckily has not attacked any of the nuclear power plants yet. But last week we had an attack on the centralized spent fuel storage facility, which storages spent nuclear power elements for depositing them or for working with them later. So attacking this facility means that could lead to fire radiation and, of course, more danger to the population. Apparently, that did not happen. It was a facility that was receiving containers of spent nuclear fuel, just the building was damaged. The radiation situation remains stable, but we expected that Russia may attack some of those facilities, and that's what's happening. In terms of the World Bank and IMF saying that Ukraine will need that much money per year. Well, let me just notice that the environmental damage, according to the Ukrainian government alone, is over 154 billion US dollars. How this environmental damage is going to be fixed, I'm sure Ukraine is going to get an extension for this, addressing these problems. You remember that Bulgaria and Romania, when they were joining the European Union, they were not up to date. They have not done enough in some reform areas, but they were given this monitoring mechanism and given several years of extension to address such crucial parts such as judicial reform, corruption, and organized crime. This one is now Ukrainians' fault. So the European Union probably will be helping a lot more and also will be giving them additional time, maybe past accession, to address some environmental problems. Several things the government is doing regardless of the difficulties that they're facing now with the war and the organized attack on the Russian energy facilities, which is quite successful, leading to shortages of gas in Russia and in Crimea as well. The greenhouse gas reduction, the Cabinet of Ministers approved a long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy until 2050. That was just recently. It outlines the path toward achieving climate neutrality and decarbonizing the economy. The strategy, if implemented, is going to lead to GDP growth of up to 2.1%. This is going to add to GDP growth. It's not going to reduce it. It's not going to keep it the same, but it's a very promising trend if they manage to implement the strategy. The National Energy and Climate Plan until 2030 was also approved. There are a lot of loans that are given to private companies, to private citizens to generate energy. Most of them is renewable energy, but also for building the power plants and thermal power plants with gas in particular. There is a tranche approved by the European Union funding for the Ukraine Facility Program that is going ahead because Ukraine has managed to achieve necessary results in its reform of the energy sector. And IMF has also just achieved an agreement with Ukraine, a top-level agreement that is going to pave the way for the next tranche of funding for 690 million. So we know some energy companies are in debt because of the war, mostly Naftogaz Group it has outstanding debt and it has to be addressed, but they're getting also an extension. So all this is showing trust in Ukrainian government's ability to implement reform, decentralize the energy sector, deal with corruption, modernize it, turn it into a more renewable energy sources and green energy, and address the main problems of the past, where the energy sector was the vessel, the vehicle for corruption and Russian influence. It was so heavily penetrated by local barons and oligarchs and Russian interests that it was impossible to salvage it from these hands. Now, the war is somehow, in some ways, is making, opening the door for those reforms. And as bad as the war is, the fact that this is happening is very, very positive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I'm happy to note that you mentioned an issue that people don't normally consider an economic issue, and that's the environment. And that proves, that this war has had not only an impact on the economy in terms of what we talk about, energy, infrastructure, et cetera, but also on areas like the environment, particularly if you look at the agricultural sector. A lot of Ukraine's agricultural land has been contaminated through bombing and laying of mines, and that's going to be a big, big issue for the Ukrainians to deal with after the war. Anyway, now, Ariel, let's turn to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Walter and the organizers for doing this God's work year after year, and I'm happy to be a part of it. the general topic of my comments are about how Ukraine managed not just to survive, but turn its economy into a strategic asset now and going into the future, preparing for growth. But before that, I briefly talked to Walter. I want to mention something that is coming out in Germany. There's going to be a court proceedings against Ukrainian officer who was in charge of blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. And there's a book coming out about that. And I spent an hour listening to the author of the book this morning at one of the think tanks. And I must say, cranking the numbers, the Nord Stream 1 was 55 BCM, billion cubic meters a year in 2021. Actually, it exceeded the capacity. It supplied 59.2 BCM to Europe, and the pipeline, the two pipelines accompanying Nord Stream 2 was another 50 or so BCM that were completed in the fall of 21, never filled and never supplied. But if the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 both were supplying gas to Europe, Russia would be gaining $36 billion a year, year after year. So that for 5 years of the war, it's 170 billion if my math is correct. And Ukrainians did it in the first month of the war. They thought outside of the box. They hit the Russians where it hurts. They inflicted unbearable damage because this was Putin's baby. This was started by Schroeder in Nord Stream 1, and then Nord Stream 2, Merkel sold it to Putin because Germany was so dependent on and benefiting from the Russian natural gas, cheap Russian natural gas, that Merkel went and sold that project to Putin after 2014. And they used available resources. It was a very low cost operation. And then in the end, they maintained plausible deniability. The author cannot ascertain that President Zelensky even knew about this operation. Apparently, he's speculating. But this is to say Ukraine knows how to do the max, beyond the max, with very, very limited resources. And that is a very important lesson for everybody in any conflict. So what do we have now? We have damage to the economy going from 24 to 25, from $176 billion to $195 billion. Everybody talks about the damage Ukraine is inflicting on the Russian oil and gas infrastructure. That is still 5 times smaller relative to the cumulative damage that Ukraine suffered from the Russians. So make your own calculations. The production in agriculture is about 65% of what it was in 2020. There's about 1 million hectares of farmland are contaminated by mines and unexploded ordnance, including 600,000 hectares in the south that were stripped off irrigation after the Russians destroyed the Kakhovka Dam in 23. So Ukraine is suffering a lot of physical damage, a lot of economic damage. Andres mentioned that roughly 40% of the steelmaking capacity after the destruction of Azovstal and the elite steelworks, 40% of smelting capacity is down. But at the same time, the resources are very large, not just in iron ore and magnesium and other natural resources. So God willing, after the war, Ukraine will come back and rebuild and surpass the capacities that it had. And in that, energy is absolutely key. One of the key achievements, one of the major accomplishments of Ukraine was the connection to the European electric network that happened just on the eve of the war. So that allowed Ukraine to receive electricity from Europe. Russia is very methodically destroying the substations, the 750 kilovolt and 330 kilovolt substations, and fracturing the grid. That's a horrible thing that they're doing to Ukraine. And the power stations that colleagues mentioned are absolutely vital for continuation of the functioning of the economy. If the grid will be saved, and one of the recommendations is to put more air and drone defenses around the grid and around the substations. If the grid continues to function well, then the economy can continue to function, and then the reconstruction will take place. If not, Ukraine is facing more problems vis-a-vis the economy and vis-a-vis the civilian population. On the regulatory and soft policy issues, as colleagues mentioned, fighting the corruption is very important. Getting to the bottom of the Midas scandal, Energoatom, and prosecution of senior officials that are suspected of corruption, sending a strong signal to everybody, and also interfaces with the EU in the desired way to facilitate European integration. On demographics, an important issue that there's 1.2 million people aged 18 to 34, people who can serve in the military, who are refugees in Europe, and they also are the cohort that will be key for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And now, in the polling data, the commitment of those to go back, of that 1.2 million, goes down from 32% in 2024 to 22% in 2025. So only 22% want to go back to Ukraine in 25. That is something to addressed by the government of Ukraine. Finally, the 5 policy recommendations. The grid is a security, critical security issue, protecting the grid with the Gepards and the Skynex and other capabilities. Operationalize the risk-sharing architecture to allow Ukraine to tap into US-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund and Ukraine-US Resource and Defense Framework Agreement, and working with the EU on Pierce PPP framework. Third, resolve the EU steel quota standoff. Fourth, sequence the investment correctly. Brownfield rehabilitation, modular power, logistics corridor storage, electric storage, and then go to greenfield and mining and large-scale processing once security conditions improve. Finally, make institutional reforms at the price of admission, enforce it. The IMF 8.1 billion program, the EU 90 billion euro loan and reconstruction financing broadly are now explicitly conditioned on the VAT, customs reform, anti-corruption enforcement, and judicial independence. That is absolutely necessary. So the machinery of confidence in Ukraine are security, power as an electric power, rules, finance, and time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Usual, very insightful comments. In particular, I want to thank you for bringing us up to date on the views regarding the Nord Stream pipeline. I think the pipeline underscores the fact that the war is not just Russia and Ukraine, but Europe also, quite frankly, in many ways. With that, I'd like to just turn over to Joseph now.
Sure. I'd like to begin, Walter, thank you to you and your team for the invitation to be here. It's a terrific event. Glad to be part of it. I'd like to speak today on things related to reconstruction, and I'd like to divide my comments between what I'm going to call resilience and sovereign recovery. Resilience meaning the activities that are going on today and historically through the war that have allowed the prosecution of the war to continue from at least from the civilian and government side. And I'd like to shift in the second half of my presentation to the future and the idea of the planning necessary for after the war is over and then thinking about recovery. So I'm going to divide between what I'm calling resilience actions that either are or have taken place and recovery. Those are the planning for what will happen in the future. And they're quite different. I think it's really important to emphasize something that's been said, I think, by more than one people on the panel today, that as Russia administers its attacks on Ukraine, it does so deliberately, with not only the intention of destroying physical infrastructure, but destroying economic capabilities, institutional systems, operations, and human security, among others. It's deliberate and it is not random. And a very high percentage of attacks outside of just physical infrastructure destruction on the front line are targeted for the purposes of diminishing interoperability of systems. So when you attack energy, for example, you affect systems very broadly. When you attack cyber infrastructure, you attack systems broadly. When you attack water systems, you affect other systems very broadly. I could go on and on and on. The idea of these attacks being non-random and deliberate, focusing on diminishing interoperability of systems, is a degrading process that affects civilian life and, of course, military capacities. It's easy to find information if you're interested on the extent of physical damage. These have been cataloged reasonably well, I think. I would point to the RADA process that's done on an annual basis, rapid damage assessment. If you're interested in those kinds of information, that's where some of these estimates on cost are oftentimes documented. The cost of physical damage reconstruction right now is estimated at around $600 billion. I agree that it's low. I think the cost will be substantially higher than that in reconstruction. And much of the emphasis on the physical destruction has been documented as in areas of housing, transportation, energy, commerce, industry, etc. And it's extensive across all of the sectors that will all require a significant amount of physical infrastructure advances as we think about things moving forward. As the war has been prosecuted and as we think about maintaining infrastructure within Ukraine for operations during wartime, it's very important to point to significant efforts and successes that have taken place in management of this resilience process. Obviously, a huge amount is invested in defense and security, but beyond that, I would point to, Howard, you referred to digitization. I'm going to call it cyber infrastructure. It's been amazingly well kept and advanced during time of war throughout Ukraine. Under war conditions, maintaining of transportation infrastructure has been substantial. It's been degraded, but the efforts have been huge and they need to be pointed out. The maintenance of logistics systems, the fact that we're still able to generate 60 to 70% exports of grain, I think that was 60-ish%. It's significant, and that points to the Black Sea operations and rail transport. What doesn't get mentioned very often are core services, water, sanitation, base level power, etc., that are incredibly important to civilian life and the maintaining of activity in the country. And the sector that has been remarkable, truly unbelievable, is the innovation ecosystem that's developed. And I actually believe that to be an infrastructure component of the Ukrainian economy going forward. The innovation has been demonstrated across all of these sectors and into things like drones is absolutely remarkable. So that's a little bit on capturing some of the things related to resilience, and now turning towards the future and thinking about things in a post-war Ukraine. I oftentimes discuss my background is, maybe it's already shown, as engineering, but steel, concrete, labor, yes, of course, necessary, insufficient. When we think about the future of Ukraine, necessary but insufficient. What needs to be thought of is a much broader context of the recovery that includes restoration of governmental activities, economic activity, civilian life, and these all integrate with what we think of as infrastructure systems, cyber, physical, etc. These integrate very closely into the administration of security and rule of law. We need to be thinking about those aspects going forward. Safety is going to be an enormously complex challenge for the citizens of Ukraine. More in a minute. And then establishing resilient infrastructure systems, and Anders mentioned too, I think really important with regard to ports in the Black Sea. Maintaining Black Sea Act is hugely important. Power systems, and we're talking about several conversations on that already, but there's many others to be thinking about in terms of resilient systems going forward. I wanted to highlight one of the concerns that engineers have in reconstruction that's going to be very difficult for Ukraine, and something that can be addressed but will have to be thought thoughtfully, and that's what I would classify as remnants of war. Landmines. Ukraine is now the most heavily landmine country in the world. Unexploded ordnance, usually called UXO, is a terrible problem that we're going to be working on for generations in Ukraine. The extent of rubble that exists in Ukraine is difficult to even quantify, but it represents hazards and concerns in the ability to reconstruct. An enormous level of hazards, chemical, biological, and radiological, that all will have to be thought of in terms of environmental elements in reconstruction. And the ecological damages are just now being recorded. The dam, the Kharkova Dam, was a huge ecological catastrophe, but war is an ecological catastrophe, and measuring those or recovering from those will be a challenge. Speaking specifically about future planning, out with the old, in with the imagine. Rebuilding Soviet architecture, why would you ever? Right? Why did they do it in the first place? That's a question for textbooks, I guess. But the imagine is an important part here, because I think it's very easy to say, well, we can just do that. Well, how should we do that? And I think that imagination is something that needs to be fostered. And I think if there's any place that can do it, it's Ukraine. European Union integration will be vital, incredibly important, and will help in many ways because it provides structure. But I think it in itself will not be enough. I think it'll be very important to think about the planning for the future of Ukraine's recovery to include civilian and communities very centrally in the thought process. Whether that is the issues of displacement, veterans' needs, educational systems, healthcare systems, environment, culture, arts. I could go on and on and on. These all should be thought of as part of the reconstruction planning, not just steel and concrete and labor. In the framework that I would think of this, I would call this a systems of systems challenge. There's any number of systems, from social to governance to physical and beyond, that need to be thought of in some sort of integrated mode. And I would use the term interoperability, integration, resilience, and security as key undermining thoughts on this. So one thing I would like to say just in closing, again, thank you, Walter, for the opportunity. I've heard so many times, various different events, the idea of a plan for Ukraine, and particularly a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Maybe. Marshall Plan historically is the gold standard for post-war reconstruction. But I would point out that it was 4 years after the war that the Marshall Plan was implemented. And during those 4 years, terrible events occurred in Europe, including borderline famine, recurrence to conflict, human rights abuses. I could go on and on and on. 4 years. the idea of starting the planning process after the war will in fact accomplish what that part of the Marshall Plan accomplished. And I would strongly advocate for integration and thoughtfulness in the planning as soon as possible. There are elements that are taking place. EU ascension is part of that. But I would strongly encourage that be accelerated and thought of as something as a near-term issue. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Joe, thank you very much. And don't sell yourself short as an engineer. We usually have a bunch of social scientists, and it's refreshing to have someone with a different perspective who talks about water, sanitation, and the interoperability of everything. So thank you very much for bringing that to light. That concludes our panel presentations and discussions. And I'd like to, first of all, thank everyone for participating on the panel. You all did an excellent job. I want to thank Walter again for giving this opportunity to air the concerns about Ukraine. And also thank you, Walter, for your initiative in continuing this series of conferences. I think you do yeoman's work, and it's a big benefit. And I hope everyone realizes all the hard work that Walter and his team actually puts into these efforts. So thank you again, Walter, on that. Right now, what we have time for is probably 20 minutes or so for questions. And the grading, that's the last thing to do. We'll do the grading last. I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator to ask the first question, okay? And this is going to be a kind of a theoretical question that I'm going to throw out there. We all talk about the cost for reconstruction, the costs of, attracting people to come into the country to invest, the difficulties of attracting investors, et cetera, et cetera. But there's going to be a big challenge, as I see it, in Ukraine, that once the process is put in place, how do you structure the process? Who makes the decisions? That's going to be key. We talk about the gravity and the enormity of and the extent of the damages that Ukraine has suffered. I mean, the whole country is going to have to be rebuilt. Let's put it that way. The second thing is, we're all very familiar with the outside world view of Ukraine and its corruption and the fear that corruption could creep into this system again. So how do you buffer in terms of protecting against corruption, also making the decisions as to what projects should go forward first and how quickly? Do you put this in the hands of the Ukrainian government? Do you put this in the hands of an international committee to operate the system and to filter everything? I'm just throwing out the concept here. I'd like to get a view from the panelists, how they would see this thing operate. I, for example, fear that governments and the international financial institutions and probably the private sector would probably seek some kind of guarantees or buffers against the enormity of the problems and also the possibility of corruption. So with that, I'll just throw it out to anyone who wants to try to tackle that question. Anders?
Yeah, well, happy to go on it. As I mentioned, Ukraine needs about $100 billion a year, and it gets it. Half of it goes to defense, and that will not be needed in the future. Ukraine has a budget deficit, which is steadily about 20% of GDP, which is then fully covered by international support. So essentially, foreigners pay for the social sector of the budget, and the Ukrainians pay for the military. So the Ukrainian part of the Ukrainian budget goes to the military. Of course, this will be completely changed later on. And as it is now, the EU more or less has financing for this year and next. And but I trust that this will continue for a long time. So what I would presume we will see is that there will be a gradual move from public financing if the war hopefully ends or abates in some way, and that there will be more private financing. Amazingly, investment is still going on to a surprising extent. And you might say it's not surprising. You have to rebuild the roads and the power stations immediately. You can't leave it to later. You need a certain infrastructure part. And of course, the military, well, what Howard is dealing with is now developing very fast indeed. Corruption, how do you handle it? Well, the EU will fight tooth and nail, as they've already shown, for the anti-corruption bodies for the high-level corruption. Howard mentioned privatization will become ever more important, and I think that this is something that we should put to the forefront now. Ukraine, for example, has produced for the last 30 plus years 20 billion cubic meter gas a year. It's almost been completely constant. There's no reason for that. Ukraine has the second biggest gas reserves in Europe. So if we compare with how much Norway, the country with the biggest reserves, have, Ukraine should produce 70 billion cubic meters a year. We have hammered on this for decades, and it doesn't happen. And why? Because we have Naftagaz that is responsible for 80% of the gas production and blocks everything else. Privatize, split up, and give opportunity to put in private investment, both Ukrainian and international. And what has worked very well is the decentralization of the power and the election of the mayors who have been quite powerful. Previously, before the revolution of dignity, Ukraine was extremely centralized. That is no longer true, but the EU pushes very hard for the decentralization. So decentralization plus local accountability are big answers. And then some kind of Ukraine investment fund, international support fund, what the OECD did for the Marshall Plan is needed. It's natural, as we have all argued for years in various groups, that it should be based in Brussels. In effect, the European Union is doing much of it, but this should be put on a formal basis. The Ukrainian government already has a national fund for reconstruction. So Ukraine has done the job. It's and since the US is essentially out of it, it's natural that it should be the EU that pushes this further. Thank you.
Howard, I think Howard won.
So, Ambassador, we addressed this question actually in a report from 2023 with Ambassadors Jim Dobbins, Charlie Reese, and Gabby Torini. I always have to move the product at every opportunity. And I'll give you kind of short, simple answers. How do you structure the process? Who should be in charge? The Ukrainians should be in the lead for 3 reasons. First, just for legitimacy. Second, they know Ukraine best. Third, Marshall Plan is not a good comparator here because the Marshall Plan was 1 to many. The United States exercised enormous control. This will be many to 1. And every government has its own requirements. Congress has the longest of requirements for USAID. Every government has requirements. No way that you want hundreds and hundreds of requirements from donors governing what Ukraine does. But you do want the oversight, right? And you want all of those governments to have representatives on the ground in Ukraine, not quarterly meetings, but coordinating. Last thing is how to protect against corruption. Here we've seen you need very strong conditionality. They're still going to rely on donors for reconstruction. Donors have to be willing to pull money, as I just learned today, the EU did with the NABU laws earlier, willing to pull. And so that's probably the best way to handle corruption.
Just a brief comment. Already a lot of civil society think tanks are involved in plans for the construction of Ukraine. And these organizations are starting to play a very prominent role in the reform process as well. For example, the Dixie group, which is an energy think tank, gave their input on the climate legislation and the greenhouse legislation, and it went through. The government accepted it. Apparently, this collaboration is very good. When you have an executive body to be in charge of how the money is spent, it's very important to also include the local authorities, because the mayors are the ones that are going to manage and supervise this job. But also have a civilian board, civil society, public board that can oversee, like, and monitor how the money is spent and raise the flag, raise the alarm when there is corruption or suspicion of corruption. If there is no participation by the executive, the local authorities, and civil society in that respect, the process won't be legitimate. Of course, donors are controlling their money. They are going to oversee how their money is spent. But this internal process, and Howard is absolutely right, should be run by the Ukrainians and monitored and supervised by independent Ukrainian organizations outside, can have access to everything, see the books, see how money is spent, test whether the roads are well built or they are wavery, like in many other countries. And because the Ukrainian people are so committed to joining the European Union, I think this process is going to go relatively fast. It's not going to drag like in Serbia for 15 years. It is going to be a process driven by the people, with a strong participation by the government that wants the process to be completed. And of course, you should never forget the parliament will have to play a very, very critical role in having a committee that is in charge of supervising how this money is spent and what is happening, and just have information about everything that's going on.
I don't know, Ariel and Joe, do you want to add anything?
A quick comment on sort of the diplomatic level. In the recent years, relationships with Hungary and Poland currently became rocky. I think the government of Ukraine will do well addressing the conflicts and disagreements and straightening it out. You do not want key Central European countries being not 100% on board and some in a position to undermine your accession process. The strategic goal is having Ukraine in the EU, and everything else, including history, is a secondary policy. Furthermore, a clear distinction between the necessary infrastructure preparation, like demining, right? Demining cannot be a commercial project. The money for demining and recommissioning of agricultural land, etc., has to be done with the government investment and European investment and supervision. Everything else can be commercialized, should be commercialized. And I can't agree more with Anders. I felt like a broken record writing year after year since the 2010 or 2012 about Naftogaz and about how Naftogaz blocked investment, including by American companies. Walter remembers all these meetings with investors that got burned. I know them personally, and Ukraine lost tens of billions of dollars of revenue from not privatizing oil and gas fully. I would caution in terms of renewables. I know it's a huge priority for the EU, and I know that Ukraine is trying very hard, including providing feeding tariffs that are kind of high for the renewables. However, the country will be pinched for funds, and maybe negotiating a 10, 20-year exemptions and allowing more thermal generation, which is cheaper, would be a pathway to go. I honestly do not know if this is feasible My company, International Market Analysis, does consultancy work on energy policy. So if somebody wants to dig deeper, talk to me after this session. But renewables plus storage in some places is commercially viable, and I 100% support it. Like in Central Asia, like in the Arabian Peninsula, like in North Africa. Unfortunately, last time I changed, the solar exposure in Ukraine is less than in Saudi Arabia. Finally, on corruption. This is a tricky business. I have Ukrainian companies coming to me and complaining that different competing oligarchs and companies are trying to weaponize the anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine and try to weaponize the presidential administration. This is all off the record, not for attribution. This is just between friends. So how do you watch for the old decades and centuries old patterns of trying to use corruption allegations against your business competitors or by dirty high-level officials trying to generate a rent from squeeze the protection money from companies through weaponization of these anti-corruption investigations and law enforcement. That is indeed a challenge that Ukraine needs to address. Thank you.
Joe, do you want to say anything?
Sure, just real quickly. I agree with everything that's been said before me, but I would just add the importance of the private sector and enabling the private sector to engage. And you know that requires oversight and regulation, and that's not necessarily as simple as I made it in that statement. But in the amount of work and investment and that needs to be conducted in reconstruction and recovery, the private sector will lead. Governance will be critical, but private sector needs to be in a capacity to lead. That would be my question. Okay.
All right, thank you for your comments. Let's turn to the floor now. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. You're back there.
Roman Hajm Consort. This is basically to Dr. Åslund, but maybe anybody else who wants to go in. I remember my first trip to Ukraine in '96. You turned on any television, picked up any newspaper, and the hot topic was accession to Soyuz. It didn't matter. Everybody had an opinion. When are we going to be in? Here we are 30 years later, finally getting an invitation to step up and get into the Soyuz. The last 30 years, the history, every time Ukraine made positive progression to what the Europeans demanded, the rug got pulled out from them. We had to have the Orange Resolution to get back on track. And then again, the rug got pulled out. Then we had to have the Revolution of Dignity. And since that Revolution of Dignity, we've been fighting a war. So everybody says, well, how can you get into a Soyuz with anybody who's at war? And now, with this invitation, we're being told, you're hearing from different sources, won't be until the end of the decade. It won't be for another 10 to 15
I'm
years.
sorry to interrupt you, but we do need to get to other
Okay,
questions.
that's just a question. What is the reality, your perception of reality of this happening in the near future?
I can pick up a few questions. There was another question back there. We could bunch the questions. That gentleman there and the lady next to him, those two questions, okay?
Thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm Westlaw Chornomaz from the Ukrainian-American Youth Service Club. My question is, What steps has Europe taken to separate itself from the Russian economy, and what steps can be taken to prevent further reintegration in a post-war scenario with the Russian economy? Thank you.
I believe that young lady had a question also.
So hi, I'm Christina Johan. I'm also with the Ukrainian-American Youth Civics Club. So my question is, so you guys talked about like Ukraine's economic informality and how there's a need for a larger access to business in Ukraine. And my question is, how would you make business in Ukraine more accessible to investors or innovators outside of Ukraine, especially with the uncertainty that war brings?
Did anybody have a question on this gentleman? Or a microphone?
About the defense contracts with the European Union. As you said, anti-corruption agencies were weaponized. Sometimes, for example, missile defense, it had been slowed down for almost a year and a half, the cooperation with the Nordic countries, because of a rumor of supposed corruption that were associated with the company which was doing the procurement. I wanted to ask if it is possible to make any changes in the current process of cooperation in order to remove those obstacles, base the analysis on whatever corruption is present on some facts, not just on rumors, which are often harming Ukraine.
Okay, I think that's enough questions. We just can't keep going on to questions. That's 4 questions for the panelists. Pick and choose. Anders, I think most of them were directed in your direction.
Yeah, if I take the two first, I think the two next were mainly for Howard. On EU, it's a long process and it takes, you have to be ready for it for a long time. I mean, the spectacular thing was Yanukovych in Vilnius in November 2013, when he was not prepared to do the elementary preconditions to adopt, to support a law on prosecution in Ukraine. And therefore, Ukraine was not ready after the revolution of dignity. Yes, the things have developed, and the association agreement that was fully concluded in 2016 is a big basis for it. But accession to the European Union takes a long time because you need to adopt hundreds of laws. So it's an enormous legislative work, and it also is institutional work. So previously, Ukraine was not ready. Now it's highly ready, and we can see that the European Union is now promoting Ukraine and Moldova as much as really anybody has since the 1990s. On the question of Europe and Russia, it's an enormous sanction activity. So you can see that the trade between Europe and Russia has completely disappeared. Ariel discussed previously how the gas export through the Baltic Sea has stopped, but it has also been simply that it has been prohibited. The European Union has now adopted 20 sanctions packages and proposed 21st. So each package reduces the trade. So Russia is really almost completely isolated from Europe. There are some trade that still continues, but it's striking how little it is. Thank you.
I'll take informality, and hopefully my colleagues can take corruption. Informality is an enormously hard problem to solve anywhere. It usually involves businesses thinking, well, it's just cheaper to not register and to not pay taxes. So the question is, how do you make it? How do you give them incentives to register, pay taxes? You need simplification of administrative processes. and you need fair and legitimate tax administration. Ukraine's made remarkable strides in, is it the cyber infrastructure instead of digitization? What should I call it? I think both is fair. Okay, and with the DIA app, so the formalities are much simpler now. I think what remains largely is the reforms to tax administration, and whether people think that enforcement is fair, whether it's risk-based by the government, and the government's going to need to do that at some point or another.
First of all, just to keep it in perspective, nobody's talking about eradicating corruption 100%. It's not done in most of the places. I don't know much about Finland, but Finland is probably in the top of the list of countries without corruption. So one thing Ukrainians can do is talk to the Finns. Having said that, it's very difficult because of culture, because of norms, but it's not impossible to change it. And you change it with opening the economy, with allowing deregulation. So you taking the authority away from the bureaucrats who usually also paid very little. If you remember, well, you probably were very young, when 2003, I think, was a Rose Revolution in Georgia. The then President Misha Saakashvili, whom I know, who unfortunately is rotting in jail, took the traffic cops, the GAI, and fired all of them, and hired guys and women with university education, and the salary went from, let's say, $30 a month to $300 a month. But if you were caught taking bribes, you were fired on the spot. And also, these cops could not take cash as a fine. They only could write a ticket, right? So there are creative solutions by diminishing the numbers of nodes or instances where a bureaucrat can make a decision in exchange for a bribe. High-level corruption, when you have multi-million and billion-dollar projects, is almost a different category, and you have to develop technology, know-how, how to screen for that. But having worked in the former, in Eurasia, shall we say, all my life, and Eastern Europe, I can tell you this is an uphill battle. Things can be done and should be done, but you're not going to eradicate it entirely. And Western investors know how to work with that.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Andrew, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, let me just add on the Nordic countries. They have an almost complete transparency. That's what you need to do. In Sweden and Finland, a complete transparency act was adopted in 1766. All personal financial information is public. In Norway, they've even all tax returns on the web. If you show all personal financial information, which would be impossible in this country, then you defeat corruption. Ukraine took a big step in this direction through this registry of officials' incomes and assets. And that did a lot to improve. Ukraine used to be around 142nd country in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index out of 180. It has now, after 10 years, improved to 105th because of much improved transparency. But of course, and the digitization, the DIA that has been mentioned here. So Ukraine is on a good way, but it has much more to go.
Okay. Thank you. And we're unfortunately running out of time, so my apologies if we have not been able to address every single question. But after the panel concludes, feel free to come up and meet with the panelists and see if you could follow up on the question if it hasn't been addressed. My apologies also if I haven't had a chance to give everyone an opportunity to speak in this last round. Having said that, we are now into the grading exercise, whereby each of the panelists will grade Ukraine's progress in its economic performance over the past year. And I will go down the row starting with you, Anders. If you could please give us a grade and maybe 2 or 3 sentences explaining your rationale.
A straight A for the reasons that Howard mentioned. This has been extraordinary macroeconomic management during the war.
I'll be the skunk at the banquet. I'm going to give them a B. And to explain, I give them A+ for the macroeconomic management and fiscal policy. And energy resilience, also just outstanding. Where they've fallen down is on the business development and corruption issues. And that really needs to move forward. And I think after that happens, we'll be on a much better trajectory.
I agree with grade for energy resilience, also for reforms in the energy sector undertaken by the government in cooperation with civil society organizations. Absolutely A.
Thank you.
A.
Hey.
I'd give an A+ in what I was talking about in terms of resilience. In terms of some of the post-war planning and things that will be addressed in, for example, the energy sector, I might drop that a little bit, but on average, I'll just go with an A.
Okay. As moderator and chair of the panel, I give them an A for the simple reason that I'm not absolving them of any shortcomings that have been mentioned here, like corruption and other issues. But given the context in which they are operating an economy with the full-scale war being waged against them, and looking at the fact that over the past year, they've been able to survive the winter war by Russia against Ukraine, and at the same time have developed the drone industry into an international standard. That's quite an achievement in both those areas. They're all outside of the actual economic sphere, but they do impact the economy. So I give them an A. With that, I think this concludes the panel. I want to thank our panelists once again, and thank you, Walter, again.